I'm Alex, and along with my brother Aaron, who's somewhere on this call with the other Trip Shed screen, we are the founders and operators of the Trip Shed. Our mission here in this world of ours is to make it a better place by deepening our own and individuals' connection to the natural world and, of course, themselves and each other. We do that through transformative outdoor adventures, educational workshops, and quality gear that gets people outside. We're an experience-first outdoor store. We've both been guiding backcountry adventures for about 12 or 15 years now. We spend a lot of time in the woods. We love it. We love canoe tripping. And we are so privileged to be able to do that for a living now. A lot of what we do as well is making things, experiences, information as accessible as possible. And so we've been doing these workshops. We did a bunch last year. This is the first one of the year this year, just to get information out there and start conversations. That's a bit about us. Thank you for listening to my opening rant, and I appreciate again all of you being here. We're so excited tonight to welcome our now great friend Leslie Ann Amour, who will be speaking to the topic of Algonquin Park's history, its reconciliation, the people who have spent time living there, and a bit more about that. So without further ado, I introduce to you Leslie Ann. Leslie Ann, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you everybody for joining tonight. So as Alex mentioned, I will be sharing a presentation on and off as we go through tonight, but I really do like to keep conversations like this a little bit more informal. I want folks to know that as we go through, absolutely please drop any questions in the chat, and I'll be kind of keeping an eye on that so that I can make sure to get to them at the end. And if I see one that's relevant to exactly what I'm saying, I might go ahead and just kind of answer right then and there. So before I begin, there's a couple other little things that I want to say. One, and I don't think Alex mentioned this, and forgive me if you did and I'm repeating it, we will end the recording before we get into question and answer, because I know this can be a tough subject for folks who are less familiar with it to be able to ask questions. Folks often worry about asking the question in the wrong way or something coming across the wrong way. And so I want folks to really take this opportunity to ask questions to clear up any potential misconceptions, anything like that. And so we won't be recording that. And really, please ask me your questions. Don't worry about offending me because you're not sure how to say it. I can tell the difference between someone trying to ask a question and someone just being rude. So don't worry about that. And so here we will start. I want to cover a little bit of what we will go over. So as you can see on this fancy little agenda of mine, we're going to do a little bit of introductions. We'll go over the history of the land of Algonquin Park and that around it, our nation's contact with settlers and industry, the park, and a little bit more broadly about reconciliation and tying it back to the park and the land in the area. So who am I? Leslie Ann Indigenous, Ottawa Valley Ndonjaba, Makwarodom. So my name is Leslie Ann. I'm from the Ottawa Valley. I'm Bear Clan. Right now, I'm talking to you from the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, Toronto. And before I begin today, I think it's really important to bring into these spaces, not only talking about Indigenous ways of knowing, cultural practices, knowledge, but to actually do these things. And so one of the traditions in my nation, one of our practices is that often before a gathering or a meeting, we will smudge. And smudging is, for my nation, often burning sage or sweetgrass. It can also be cedar or tobacco. And the purpose of it is like a cleansing practice. And it's meant to bring you into that meeting, that conversation, that event in the right headspace to ground you. And so before we started, I had my sage, I lit it. It's not smoking too much now. I can only light it a little bit because I am in an apartment and I don't think my neighbors would be too happy if I set off a fire alarm and had us all evacuate. But it's the same kind of idea of how, you know, in schools in Canada, kids will often start the day listening to the Canadian anthem. Or when you walk into a business meeting, you might all shake hands around the room before you start. smudging before an event is one of the indigenous equivalents of these kind of practices, these openings. And so I like to live the talk. I like to incorporate these things into settler spaces as a way of disrupting a little bit of the narrative that there's only one way to do things. I'm a lawyer. I focus on environmental, indigenous, and sports law. I'm also an avid outdoors person. I've been scuba diving since I was 12 years old. You can find me pretty much any time I have a choice on some body of water or under it, whether it be camping, canoeing, or diving. And that's where I'm happiest. I want to get a sense of who everybody in this room is. This room, this screen. That part of my language has not yet adapted to Zoom, I guess. And so I'm going to stop screen sharing and we're going to do a little bit of an icebreaker where I'm going to put us all on gallery view. I encourage you to as well. And I'm going to ask a couple statements. And if folks have done this thing, I want you to raise your hand. And just to get a sense of, who's in the room and what perspectives folks are coming at this from. If you have your camera on, feel free to raise your hand, or there is the raise your hand function on Zoom as well. And if you want to raise your hand, it's under the reactions function that should be at the bottom of your screen. And so, who here has gone backcountry camping before? Okay. Okay, most of the room, but not quite about a third. Okay, that's pretty good. Who here, you can raise your hand if you, for this one, who here has been to a powwow before? Okay, a few less, but I'm pleasantly surprised by the number of people who are raising their hand for this one. That's great. Give you guys a moment to drop your hands. Raise your hand if you've gotten the opportunity to see a bear in their natural habitat. Ooh, more people for this one than backcountry camping. That's exciting. Okay. For the next one, who knows whose traditional territory they're on right now? Ooh, this one might be the most popular I've seen so far. That's really exciting because I bet 5-10 years ago, there would not have been as many raised hands. So that's really exciting. And my last one is probably the one I think will be the most challenging. Raise your hand if you've ever had an Indian taco before. Okay. A few Indian tacos. I like that. For anyone who hasn't had one, an Indian taco is a very classic powwow food. It's usually bannock served with taco toppings. So bannock, seasoned ground beef, sour cream, lettuce, cheese, tomatoes, all of that good stuff. Highly recommend. If you're in Toronto, I highly recommend Powwow Cafe. Actually, they serve Indian tacos. It's great. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint here. So this is really helpful. This gives me a little bit of a sense of who in this room has thought about some of these things before, has some experience with them, and who has experience with camping and an interest in the land, and who might be totally new to these conversations. So that's part of why I wanted to do that, but it's also just kind of fun to see who has done some of these things and who gets to think about some new things to try. Here we go. So any conversation about Indigenous culture, Indigenous laws, Indigenous nations always has to start with the land, because the land is who we are. The land is where we come from, and the land shapes everything that we are. The land we're talking about today is mostly Algonquin Park, but I'm sorry, those are colonial boundaries that I'm going to ignore a little bit. And by a little bit, I mean a lot. So I'm also going to talk about Eastern Ontario a little bit more broadly, some of the related watersheds, including the Ottawa Valley River watershed and the Ottawa River Valley. Words are hard. So most of us can picture Algonquin Park. I even included a little picture right here, which was a deliberate choice for this reasoning. What you're looking at here, you can see those typical pines. You can see a little bit of the deciduous trees mixed in there. You can see that rugged, hilly nature of the park. You can see what kind of looks like a little bit of the edge of a hill or maybe a cliff. And the reason I bring this up is because Algonquin Park and the land around it as we know it today isn't what it was always like. About, give or take 12,000, 10,000 years ago, much of Eastern Ontario and more of the east of what is now Canada, but it's a little less relevant. Much of Eastern Ontario, including the Ottawa River Valley, all the way from basically the border of Quebec, Ottawa River, Hawkesbury, Cornwall area, up through towards Ottawa, Pembroke, including the eastern regions, touching the eastern regions of the park, was under what we now call the Champlain Sea. This area used to be under ice shelves, and later, as they were receding, as time was going on, they were under a sea. And that sea was at a much higher sea level than what we have now. And that left us with what we call relic shorelines. So going back to this image, which is just an example, I can't actually tell you if this was a relic shoreline or not. But picture, instead of looking down at a valley, you could have been looking out at a lake. And this high point would have been a lake shore. It could have been a riverside. And these relic shorelines shaped where we can see the evidence of our ancestors today and shaped the way we've been using this land since time immemorial. I believe the latest archaeological evidence from this area is about 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. There's relics from Algonquin ancestors using and living on this land. And it's because we understand that the land has changed that we know where to look for the evidence of our ancestors. We know where to look to understand how they were using this land. And the reason I wanted to go all the way back this far is because as our land has changed, as the Champlain Sea receded, as our shorelines changed, we changed with the land, because the land is who we are and the land is everything that we are. And so now that I've said it's who we are, who are we? The Algonquin Nation is big. The Algonquin Nation isn't only in Ontario, it's not only in the area of Algonquin Park. I realized I skipped a little part of my introduction. I'm Algonquin from the Bonachère Algonquin First Nation, which is a community in the eastern part of Ontario and one of the Algonquin communities that's on the Ontario side of the provincial border. Some of what I talk about is general to all Algonquin communities. Some of what I talk about is a little bit more specific to those in the Ottawa River Valley. And that's just because that's the nature of what I know. That's where I come from. That's where my family comes from. But the Algonquin nature as a whole is on both sides of the Ottawa River in Ontario and Quebec. We have our own governance systems, our own laws, our own traditions, and our own ways of being. Some of our governance structures include the clan system. As I said earlier in my introduction, Makwarodom, which means I'm Bear Clan. And our clans were our way of structuring our system, our society. We lived in groups, small communities around our territory. We would sometimes move. We would move along with the seasons, what we were hunting, what we were doing, gathering in the summer, gathering in the warmer seasons together in large groups, whether it be for ceremony, other cultural reasons, or political reasons. In what is now Ontario, there were groups living around the Madawaska River, Muskrat Lake, Morrison Island and Allumette Island in the Ottawa River. Also along the Mattawa River, all the way up to Lake Nipissing are some examples of where historically our communities have been living and gathering. One of the first encounters with Algonquin nations and the settlers was actually in the Ottawa River on the area around Allumette Island, where it was Samuel de Champlain who encountered an Algonquin community. And one of the chiefs he encountered at that time, I'm not sure if it was at this first meeting or one of his subsequent meetings as he was traveling up and down this river, was Chief Tessouat. And Chief Tessouat is a really interesting chief. And when settlers often talk about all the great things they brought to indigenous nations, I like to joke that Tessouat actually invented the 407 before the settlers did, as he was collecting a toll from those traveling up and down the Ottawa River as they were trading furs and engaging in economic activity. And this contact with settlers at this time was generally very few settlers, primarily indigenous nations interacting with each other, as settlers slowly began to understand the context of where they're living, understand who these nations were, and understand the other nations around us, whether it be the Haudenosaunee, the Cree, other Anishinaabe nations, because we all had our own political relationships with the people around us. And as the settlers were coming in, they were also slowly starting to understand these dynamics and politics. Well, they also had their own going on that they were seeking to pull us into. But I'm not going to get into too much of the history of the British and the French and the battle over the land, because if you learn anything about Canadian history in school, it generally tends to be that side of things. So I'm not going to get too into that. If folks want to have questions about that, I can try to answer them later, but I'm not going to get too much into that. I'm trying to give you a little bit of the history and a little bit of some tidbits that you don't get in the typical Ontario or Canadian high school education. And so after we've had contact with the settler nations, at this point, it hasn't been too bad yet. Small interactions here and there, but more and more folks are coming, seeking to exploit our land. And so we're going to get into a little bit of the settler industry and the industries around what is now Algonquin Park. One of the biggest was originally the fur trade, which is as many people have heard about. Often, Indigenous folks were working as part of the fur trade. They were trapping and hunting, bringing furs and selling their furs, often traveling down the Ottawa River, further into Montreal to sell their furs. As time went on in the area of Algonquin Park and Eastern Ontario, logging became a really big industry as well. And I'm going to mention a couple specific companies that are engaged in this work in the area particular to Algonquin Park and the surrounding towns. And logging primarily became a big industry through the 1800s onward. One of the first folks that I'll mention is J.R. Booth. Are folks familiar with who he is? Can I get hands up if it's a yes? Mostly I just want to gauge a little bit of the familiarity. Okay, a few. So J.R. Booth is often talked about as being a logging tycoon, which I think is really an interesting word to apply to him. Partly just because I don't tend to think about tycoons as being from the 1800s. It seems very tech mogul type to me, but alas. So J.R. Booth was one of the folks who first started logging in the area of Eastern Ontario and what is now Algonquin Park at a large scale. He was logging around some of the lakes, arriving at Depot Creek around 1870. And he purchased much of these timber rights from John Egan in, I believe it was 1867, in what is now Algonquin Park for $40,000. Only 5 years later, he was offered $1 million for those rights, as people were recognizing the value that is in this area and in the park. A lot of people don't realize that this logging in the park never stopped, and it's actually a part of why the park was created. But even today, and I'll get a little bit into this further on, there's still major logging happening on Algonquin Park. J.R. Booth spent many years well, he and his company, logging the park and sending timber down the river, primarily the Ottawa and Madawaska rivers, to Ottawa. Another company I'll mention is E.B. Eddy, which is now part of Domtar. E.B. Eddy was originally incorporated in the 1880s, and in 1850s, well, sorry, I should rephrase this. The company as it has now become part of Domtar was incorporated in the 80s, but the president had a previous business in the 1850s, which started and slowly became incorporated into what it is now. And the company operated one of its major factories in Pembroke, just outside of the park, until, I believe it was until the 90s. And that match factory was using a lot of timber coming in from the area and was one of the main sources of economic development in the area of the park, Pembroke, and the Ottawa Valley for many years. Even myself, I grew up in Pembroke, and we all still talk about it as the Eddy Match Building, no matter what it is. At one point it was a gymnastics gym. I think now it's a call center. It's always going to be the Eddy Match Building because these industries are so big in our communities and have had such a big impact on our communities and our land. And these industries being so big are what eventually resulted in a railroad being put in through the park, something a lot of people forget about. The railroad went through the park to facilitate continued logging and development of this land. And as time went on, the other major industry that was affecting Indigenous folks in this area, of course, was agriculture. When the settlers were arriving in what is now the Ottawa Valley and Algonquin Park, the Algonquins had been promised again and again that they would not lose their land. They were told by the colonial government that they would continue to be able to live on and use their land. But as settlers arrived, their land was continually allocated to settlers. Indigenous folks were seeing their land disappear right out from under them, being clear cut for farming and being owned by settlers, and they were being pushed off their land. The Algonquins did what they were told to do. They wrote letters, they wrote the petitions to the colonial government, reminding them of their agreements, of the previous letters, of what they had been promised, and they were continually ignored and ignored. I believe the earliest of the petitions is from 1776, approximately, and it's these petitions and these records that are the basis of treaty negotiations going on today, because those agreements were never honored, even though today, lawyers can look at them and say, you have a claim, you were promised something, and it was never met. Which gets into the creation of the park. The park explicitly was designed to protect industry and displace Indigenous people. When it was established in 1893, it was actually partially of land that was set aside to be a reserve for the Algonquin people in the area. That reserve was canceled. The park was created in part to continually allow the exploitation of the resources of the logging and the timber, and Indigenous people were forced to leave the park. Algonquin people were forced to leave the park, ironically named after us. We were prevented from hunting in the park, and we were charged for being in the park, even though many non-Algonquin folks, non-industry folks, were allowed to continue to reside in the borders using their seasonal leases as if nothing had changed. I've put together a resource list that the link is included on my last slide. And in particular, one of the resources I want to highlight is a TED Talk by Kirby White Duck, who previously was the chief of the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan, and is a really incredible scholar and has done a lot of work on the history of Algonquin Park. And what I'm saying quite a bit here right now is actually paraphrasing from him. And his TED Talk is really powerful about talking about this and talking about the way we continued to defy the government. I say we, broadly, my ancestors. I wasn't alive yet. I really, sounds like I'm taking credit for it. I don't mean to be. But the Algonquin people continued to defy them. A report was done by a researcher hired by the government in approximately 1993, which was used in part leading into treaty negotiations for the government to try to determine how strong the claim was to the land that the Algonquins were claiming. And that report found that Algonquin people continued to defy the government, continued to enter Algonquin Park, continued to use Algonquin Park and the surrounding land as we always had, to hunt and to fish. Some of us were convicted and charged and sent to prison. Many of us risked our freedom, had guns, ammunition, things like that confiscated, and risked their livelihoods. And it's because this is our land, always has been, always will be. And we don't, at the time, we often didn't have much choice. Indigenous folks, for many, many years under the Indian Act, were prevented from doing a lot of things we take for granted now. If you had Indian status, for many years, you could not legally become a doctor, a lawyer. You could not go to university. You could not even hire a lawyer. And so we continued to live off our land. We continued to use our land, even though it put us at great risk. And that was intentional. There's no dispute that policy towards Indigenous people at this time was not designed to have Indigenous people continue to exist. And while all of this is happening, while we're risking our livelihoods to enter the park, loggers are living in the park. There's small villages. There's a post office in the park. It's actually today one of the oldest standing buildings still in the park. And not only that, there are 2 research stations in the park, which do incredible work. I don't mean to implicate them in any way in that sense. They've made some not great decisions, I'm sure, but in terms of their complicitness, but today do really great work. There was even an astronomical observatory in the park because it was so quiet, dark sky. There were satellites pointing at the sky. And yet we were being prevented from accessing the park and continuing to exercise our rights to hunt and fish and harvest on our land. In the 80s, there began to be more significant pushback about this. It was in the 80s, many Algonquin people from what is now Pikwakanagan, for many years, the community was the Algonquins of Golden Lake. Now it's the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan. They've changed their name, but so if you're familiar with Golden Lake, that's also, that's who they are. They would enter the park deliberately in large groups, hunt, take a moose, and force these changes, make a statement, allow the police to become involved to show that we weren't relinquishing our rights to do this and we were continuing to use our land. Today, there's been quite a bit of change. Wow, I guess I really skipped ahead. I dropped on my slideshow. I apologize for that, folks. But now I can get into our nations in the park today. Today, a lot of the forestry, the logging happening in the park is done under the Algonquin Forestry Authority, which arose from debate around logging in the park. And logging in the park is a complicated issue. I'm sure I sound like I've been giving it a lot of crap, but that doesn't mean I'm against it. It's a complicated issue. And when there was a lot of debate over this, the Algonquin Forestry Authority was the result of it. And it now designates where logging can happen, what types of logging, and what can be harvested. It was established in 1974 and is a Crown agency, so not quite a private company. And the AFA, in the work they do, is part of the management of the park that goes on. The management of the park happens from both the staff and management of the park itself, bodies like the AFA, as well today, now that we've entered negotiations of a modern treaty with the Algonquins of Ontario, a collective of Algonquin communities in Ontario, there's something called co-management happening in a lot of ways, which is really exciting. Co-management is the idea that Indigenous voices, in this case, Algonquin voices, should be heard in the management of Algonquin Park. We are involved in the decision-making. We're involved in the weighing of pros and cons that are going on and decisions made about the park and other parts of our territory as well as we move forward. The modern treaty process is big and complicated and challenging. In about 2016, the collective of 10 communities signed something called an agreement in principle. The agreement in principle laid out, in broad strokes, a structure for a potential modern treaty. This agreement was signed by both the provincial, federal, and the Algonquin governments. But we're still in the process of negotiating that final treaty. In the meantime, bodies like the AFA, again, a crown agency, so technically independent from the government, but it's not a private body to be making money, but it operates as a corporation. It's a little bit weird. There's bodies like that. There's bodies that, like the government, and there's us who are engaging in forms of consultation, engaging in these disputes. I shouldn't say these disputes. In these conversations around the land use and the use of the land. And the government has certain obligations to Indigenous people. I won't get into too much of the law of it. That's not what I'm here for today, but I'm sure many folks have heard about the duty to consult. It's often making headlines in respect to pipelines or things like that. And a lot of the basis of where the modern treaty is impacting things today is the understanding that there's a duty to consult owed. And so it's through that process that we're starting to see the influence of Algonquin folks on Algonquin Park and our land. One of the aspects of this is that hunting is now being allowed in the park again. Algonquin nations that are part of the collective of the Algonquins of Ontario have opted into a tag system where community members can be allocated tags and are allowed to hunt during the designated moose season in the park. This is significant and this matters. I know to a lot of folks, it might sound just like, cool, they just want to hunt in the park, great. But for many of us, we've continued to rely on our traditional foods, on venison and moose to feed our families. My freezer's full of it right now. My dad doesn't buy meat throughout the year because we continue to subside on our traditional foods. And it's a compromise that we've made. We recognize the challenges of hunting in the park now that it's become something that's a place that's held dear to other people, where people continue to use the park. We've reached a compromise. And that's what a lot of reconciliation happening today is reaching that compromise. One of the interesting aspects of what's going on now is the opportunity for ecotourism. Much of the Algonquin traditional territory has a lot of potential for ecotourism, like the park, like the Ottawa River and the Madawaska River for whitewater tourism. And it's been really interesting to see the way some folks are adopting that idea of reconciliation, of bringing that into their life and bringing that into their industry, even when they don't have to. But the caveat again being that economic development does matter for our communities. We continue to live in a capitalist society. And so even though we're hunting again in the park, even though we're slowly being included in some of these decisions, sometimes there's still people trying to make decisions for us. I often see logging being a good example of this, of environmentalists talking about the need to stop logging in the park when it's a really complicated issue. I see people talking about the way it's stolen land, but it's also Indigenous folks who benefit from this logging today. It's one of the main economic drivers in a lot of our communities, just like the Eddie Match factory was. These issues aren't easy, they aren't simple, they're still very complicated. And that's part of why it takes so long for a modern treaty to be negotiated, because as much as we wish it were as simple as saying land back, that's really complicated to implement. And so from there, I touched on a lot of different things about what's going on today, because there's a lot of different things I could say about the park and the modern treaty process. I want to touch on a little bit about reconciliation more broadly, because I know it's a really hot button issue today for a lot of folks. And I want to bring it to a kind of a local perspective to the park. But the first thing I want to say is reconciliation is not an indigenous problem. It's not an indigenous issue. Settlers got us here too. We didn't send ourselves to residential schools. We didn't force ourselves to not leave a reserve. Settlers were involved. And so it's going to take both of us to get from where we are now to an equitable society. And for me, I really like to put this in a perspective that people can relate to. And so one of the examples I think says a lot is the fact that the narrative around Algonquin Park is so often wilderness, untamed, rugged, clean, fresh. You know, there's water you can drink in the park without it being treated. You can eat the fish from the lakes. And yet, just outside the park at Pikwakanagan, they've been on a boil water advisory since 2008. Like many indigenous communities around the country, where their access to clean water has not been given the same attention or priority as non-indigenous communities. Here in Toronto, there's communities about an hour, hour and a half outside the city that are on boil water advisories. Pikwakanagan is just outside Algonquin Park. It's also, you know, maybe an hour and a half tops from Ottawa, the nation's capital. These are solvable problems, but we haven't had the political will, we haven't had the capacity to be solving these problems on a big scale yet, because we haven't been turning our attention to the underlying issues. And oh, I see someone in the chat correct me. You're right. It's not that it's a boil water advisory. It's a contamination advisory. I so often mix that up, being boil water advisory. It's a water advisory. You cannot drink the water in Pikwakanagan. Be right. It is not boil water. Thank you for correcting me on that. Some communities, they are boil water advisories. Other communities, it is simply, you know, a water advisory. You can't drink the water. And we talk about residential schools, and many people have been seeing the headlines around graves being found at the schools and children who didn't make it home. I've talked a lot about the industry that was going on in Algonquin Park throughout much of the 18 and 1900s. This is the same time children are being sent to residential schools across the country. It's really hard to fight and protect your rights when the government is systematically trying to destroy your community and commit genocide by taking your children away. These are not separate and unconnected. They are all part of a systematic policy choice from the Canadian government over many, many years to eliminate Indigenous communities. And so I really want folks to think about how they think about Algonquin Park, how they think about the communities and the nations around Algonquin Park. And remember that, to quote Eve Tuck, decolonization is not a metaphor. When we talk about decolonization, when we talk about reconciliation, it's not just, it can't just be talk. It can't just be thinking about these issues, saying it's interesting, I've learned something, and doing nothing. It's taking steps every day to take actions to slowly unsettle the narrative that we see and to take action. I started today by talking about why I was smudging before I started this workshop. And I mentioned it's because there's so many little things we do, like listening to the Canadian anthem every day before we start a class, or going around the room and shaking hands before a meeting, that we don't think twice about because it's a settler, Western, colonial cultural practice. I wanted to disrupt that a little. And that's a really, really little example of how thinking about these things differently can slowly start to contribute to change. And I've covered a lot of different things and not a lot of time, but I wanted to leave some time for questions. And so I really, really welcome questions. And with that, I will pass it over to Alex Miigwech.